HOA Karen banned kids' birthday party for too many balloons. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was the day of Emily's 8th birthday, and the house was buzzing with excitement. Linda, her mother, had spent weeks planning the perfect party. There were going to be games, music, and, of course, balloons, lots of balloons. Emily had always loved them, and this year, she had asked for the theme to be balloons and rainbows. Linda had gone all out, securing dozens of colorful balloons in every shade of the rainbow, from giant helium-filled ones to smaller, rounder ones that would bounce around the yard as the kids played. It was going to be the perfect celebration for Emily and her friends. However, just as Linda was putting the finishing touches on the decorations, the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer the door, expecting a delivery or maybe a late RSVP from one of the parents. Instead, she found Karen standing there, her arms crossed, wearing that same scowl Linda had come to dread over the past years since Karen had moved into the neighborhood. "Hi, Karen," Linda said, trying to keep the tone of her voice friendly, though she could already feel a sense of dread settling in her stomach. "Linda," Karen said curtly, her voice sharp. "I need to talk to you about this party." Linda's heart sank. She'd known Karen had some opinions about the neighborhood, about how things should be done. But she didn't expect the judgment to extend to something as harmless as a child's birthday party. "What's the problem?" Linda asked, forcing a smile. "It's just a few decorations. I thought the kids would enjoy it." Karen shook her head, her face contorting into a frown. "No, Linda. It's not just a few decorations. It's a lot of balloons, too many, actually. You're violating the HOA guidelines about excessive decorations. They're too much for a residential area. They're going to make the neighborhood look tacky." Linda blinked, unsure of whether she was hearing this correctly. "Karen, it's just a kid's birthday. The kids love balloons. It's not like it's permanent. They'll be gone by tomorrow." Karen didn't budge. "I'm afraid that's not the issue. I've already spoken to the HOA, and they agree that this kind of display is unnecessary. You need to take them down. The party is over before it even starts." Linda felt her chest tighten with anger. She knew the HOA was strict about certain things, but this was ridiculous. "Karen, you can't seriously be telling me I have to remove decorations for my daughter's party just because you don't like them. The HOA has never interfered with anyone's birthday before." "It's not just me," Karen snapped. "I've had several complaints, and this goes against the standards of the neighborhood. You need to respect the rules, or I'll be forced to escalate this." Linda stood there for a moment, stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening. Her daughter's birthday, the one day she had been looking forward to all year, was being ruined by someone who had nothing better to do than police other people's joy. "You're going to ruin my daughter's birthday over a few balloons?" Linda asked, incredulous. Karen gave a tight, satisfied smile. "If you don't remove them, I'll have no choice but to take this up with the HOA and make sure there are consequences." Linda stood there, speechless, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to stand her ground, but what was the point? The HOA was notorious for siding with Karen, and she knew that if she didn't comply, she'd be facing a long battle over something that shouldn't even have been an issue. With a heavy heart, she reluctantly agreed to remove some of the balloons, though it pained her to do so. The last thing she wanted was to escalate the situation further, especially when it came to her daughter's happiness. As she began deflating some of the balloons, her neighbors began arriving. The kids were disappointed, but Emily, ever the trooper, shrugged and smiled. "It's still going to be fun, Mom. We don't need all the balloons." The party continued, though the sense of joy was somewhat dampened. It was hard to ignore the feeling that something was missing, especially when the excitement of Emily's friends seemed to fade as they took in the reduced decorations. But the worst part was the way the HOA, with Karen's encouragement, had robbed a child of the experience she had dreamed of for months. That night, after all the kids had gone home and the party had wrapped up, Linda sat on her front porch, exhausted. The quiet of the evening was disturbed only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She found herself thinking about how unjust everything felt. Karen had not only ruined her daughter's special day, but she had also made her feel small and insignificant in her own home. But Linda was no stranger to adversity, and the more she thought about the situation, the more a thought began to form in her mind. If Karen wanted to play by the rules, then maybe it was time to show her just how well those rules could be bent. The idea came to Linda in a flash. What better way to respond to Karen's overzealous behavior than with a harmless, hilarious prank that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about how out of line Karen had been? The perfect retaliation, she realized, was right in front of her. It was the balloons. If Karen wanted to dictate what was allowed in the neighborhood, then Linda would give her a lesson in how rules could be turned on their head, all while keeping things lighthearted and fun. No harm done, just a good laugh at Karen's expense. The next morning, Linda and a few of her neighbors, who had all heard about what Karen had done and were equally fed up with her behavior, hatched a plan. They would wrap Karen's car in balloons. Not just a few, but an entire sea of colorful, helium-filled balloons, completely covering her car from top to bottom. It would be the perfect response, a reminder to Karen that not everything could be controlled by someone like her. It was time to remind her that the world didn't revolve around her rigid, uptight views of what was appropriate and acceptable. As the sun began to set, the plan went into action. Linda and the neighbors worked quickly, laughing under their breath as they secured the balloons to Karen's car, tying them carefully to every possible spot: the side mirrors, the door handles, the roof, even the tires. By the time they were done, Karen's car was completely invisible, swathed in a mass of colorful balloons. It was a sight to behold. The next morning, as Karen was getting ready to leave for work, she walked outside to the most surreal sight imaginable. Her car, which she had always kept pristine and perfect, was entirely covered in bright, cheerful balloons. For a moment, Karen just stood there, her jaw slack with disbelief. She looked around, clearly confused, before her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She saw the neighbors peeking out from their windows, and Linda, standing in her yard with a knowing smile on her face. "What in the world is this?" Karen shouted, her face turning red. But Linda couldn't help but laugh. The sight was too much. Karen had spent so much time policing everyone else's behavior, and now she was the one left laughingstock. The neighbors, who had all been complicit in the harmless prank, couldn't contain their chuckles either. It was a moment of lighthearted revenge, a small but sweet reminder to Karen that sometimes a little bit of humor could go a long way in showing someone how ridiculous they truly were. The news spread quickly, as small-town pranks often did. By the end of the day, everyone on the block had heard about Karen's balloon-covered car, and the story made its way to the local news. The reporters had a good-natured laugh about the harmless revenge and the irony of Karen's obsessive need to control the neighborhood's decorum being turned back on her in such a colorful, ridiculous way. As for Karen, she didn't speak to Linda or any of the neighbors for weeks. No one knew if she was more embarrassed or angry, but one thing was clear: she had learned an important lesson. Not everything could be dictated by rules and conformity. Sometimes, it was okay to let things be, to allow a little bit of joy and messiness into life. And as for Linda and her neighbors, they had a new sense of unity, a new understanding that sometimes the best way to stand up to unreasonable authority was with a bit of humor and a lot of balloons. The days that followed the balloon-covered car prank were filled with an unusual mix of satisfaction and unease. Linda couldn't help but smile whenever she thought of Karen's reaction, her pristine car now a spectacle of bright, colorful balloons, completely unrecognizable, parked awkwardly in front of her house as if it had just been swallowed by a rainbow. The humor of it all was undeniable, and the neighbors had all shared in the moment of collective joy that came from seeing Karen, who had long imposed her rigid standards on everyone, finally get a taste of her own medicine. But as Linda went about her days, she began to notice the subtle ripple effects of the prank, small, quiet changes in the dynamics of the neighborhood. For starters, Karen, who had once been a seemingly constant figure in the community, now found herself a bit more isolated. The phone calls from the HOA were noticeably less frequent. And the usual complaints she had lobbed at neighbors for everything from the position of their lawn chairs to the decorations in their front yards seemed to have stopped. The prank had somehow stripped her of her power, and without the constant support of the HOA or her self-appointed role as the neighborhood enforcer, she was left to stew in her own discomfort. The once pristine car was a daily reminder of her own hypocrisy, an embarrassment she couldn't shake off easily. Linda's own life, on the other hand, felt a little lighter. She had stood up for herself and for her daughter in the most unexpected way, and in doing so, she had found an ally in the very community Karen had tried to dominate. Neighbors who had once looked at Linda with polite indifference now greeted her with smiles and waves, their conversations carrying a note of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. Word had spread quickly about the balloon prank, and though Linda hadn't set out to become the neighborhood hero, that's exactly what she seemed to have become. It was an odd feeling, but a welcome one. She wasn't just the woman next door anymore, she was the one who had taken down the neighborhood's self-appointed sheriff, and for that, people respected her. One afternoon, Linda was sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee when one of her neighbors, Julie, walked by with her dog. Julie had always been friendly but had kept her distance, perhaps wary of the fallout from Karen's constant griping. Today, however, she stopped by the fence and smiled at Linda. "Hey, Linda, I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice full of warmth. "I think a lot of us were getting tired of Karen's constant complaining, but none of us knew how to stand up to her. What you did. It was exactly what needed to happen." Linda blinked, surprised by the genuine appreciation in Julie's voice. She hadn't realized just how much the community had been affected by Karen's behavior until now. It had always felt like Karen was just one person, but it seemed her influence had stretched far beyond the confines of her own home. "I didn't really think about it that way," Linda admitted. "I just wanted to get my daughter's party back on track. I never imagined it would go this far." Julie laughed, shaking her head. "Well, it went far, all right. You've become a bit of a legend around here. And I think it's given a lot of people the confidence to stand up to Karen. You're not just the hero who pranked her car, you've kind of set a new tone for this whole neighborhood." Linda felt a swell of pride at the words, but it was quickly followed by the weight of responsibility. She hadn't expected any of this. The neighborhood had always been quiet, somewhat aloof, and focused on keeping up appearances. Now, after the prank, there was a sense of unity, of shared understanding that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let things go a little and not be so concerned about appearances. It felt like the invisible walls that had kept the community distant were starting to break down. Despite the laughter and the growing sense of community, Linda couldn't ignore the underlying tension that remained. She had been careful not to cross any lines, not to push the joke too far, but Karen's anger was bound to boil over sooner or later. The question now was how Karen would respond. Linda knew Karen had her pride, and she wasn't the type to take a blow to her ego lying down. It was only a matter of time before Karen would try to get back at her, and Linda wasn't sure what that would look like. The air in the neighborhood was lighter, yes, but it was also charged with the kind of unease that comes before a storm. One evening, as Linda was finishing up dinner and getting the kids ready for bed, she heard a car pull up outside. The sound of tires rolling over gravel made her glance out the window. It was Karen's car, now restored to its former spotless condition. Linda had half expected that Karen would have kept the balloons on the car for some kind of public display of defiance, but instead, Karen had clearly chosen to remove all traces of the prank. The car now stood in front of Karen's house, pristine as ever, but Linda couldn't help but notice the stiff way Karen carried herself as she got out of the car. It was as though the whole experience had deflated her, just as much as her car had been deflated by the balloons. Linda didn't want to be the one to escalate things further, but she also didn't want Karen to think she had been silenced by her retaliation. She didn't need to make things worse, but she also wasn't going to let Karen's behavior return to normal without acknowledging the change. So, Linda stood up, took a deep breath, and walked out onto the front porch. "Hey, Karen," she called, her voice casual, but with an underlying strength. "Nice to see you've got your car all cleaned up." Karen's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she spotted Linda standing on her porch. There was no smile, no acknowledgement of the prank. Instead, Karen crossed her arms, clearly stewing in her own frustration. "You think this is funny, Linda?" she snapped, her voice brittle. Linda wasn't intimidated. "I think it was a harmless joke. You've been making life difficult for everyone around here for a long time, Karen. People were just looking for a little fun, a little relief from all the rules. Maybe you should learn to lighten up." Karen's nostrils flared, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she turned on her heel and stalked back inside, slamming the door behind her. Linda stood there for a moment, watching Karen disappear into her house. She had no idea what would come next, whether Karen would stew in silence, plotting her next move, or whether she would finally realize that her reign of judgment had come to an end. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood slowly settled into a new rhythm. The subtle tension that had hung in the air for so long began to dissipate. Linda noticed that the other neighbors started to relax more, their conversations lighter, their interactions less stiff. People were no longer tiptoeing around Karen's influence. Even the children, who had once been hesitant to play outside, now ran freely in the streets, laughing and enjoying the newfound freedom. The HOA, though it had remained mostly silent on the matter, seemed to turn a blind eye to the situation, allowing the community to find its own way without interference. Linda's daughter, Emily, had the best summer of her life. Her birthday, while a little altered, had become the talk of the neighborhood. And though Karen had yet to make her next move, Linda knew that the community had changed. It had become a place where people could express themselves, where laughter could be shared openly, and where the pranks, when they were harmless, could become a symbol of resistance against unreasonable authority. Linda had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: the neighborhood had shifted, and she was no longer afraid to stand up for what was right, even if it meant breaking the rules. As for Karen, Linda didn't need to worry. She had already lost. The balloons had spoken louder than any complaint could ever have. The weeks following the balloon prank had a strange feeling of quiet after the storm. It wasn't the complete peace that Linda had hoped for, but the subtle shifts in the neighborhood dynamics were unmistakable. For the first time in a long while, the neighbors seemed to relax, letting go of the constant tension that Karen's behavior had created. The quiet whispers behind closed doors had diminished, and the kids were back to playing freely in the streets, unafraid of crossing any invisible lines. There was a sense of unity that hadn't been present before, even if it was born from a shared moment of rebellion. The neighborhood had, for the first time in ages, found a way to be together, albeit in a way that wasn't entirely conventional. However, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. It wasn't just the way Karen had walked past her house the day after the prank, barely sparing her a glance, or the cold silence that had stretched between them. There was something in Karen's posture, the way she carried herself after the prank, that suggested a brewing storm. Karen wasn't the type of person to simply let something go. No, Karen was going to find some way to reclaim her authority. Linda knew that. But at the same time, she was no longer afraid of what Karen could do. After all, she had already taken a stand, and that alone had changed the way she saw the world around her. Linda had no idea when or how Karen would strike back, but she wasn't about to let herself be intimidated. Instead, she went on with her life, quietly enjoying the peace that had settled over the neighborhood. Emily had been thrilled with the attention her birthday had gotten after the balloon incident, and the kids in the area seemed to have taken on a new sense of freedom. They weren't worried about rules anymore, at least not the ones that didn't make sense. And, while the adults still adhered to the more formal norms of suburban life, there was a new undertone of camaraderie, a sense of connection that hadn't been there before. Even Linda's relationship with her neighbors improved. More people greeted her with smiles, and Julie, who had once kept her distance, now stopped by occasionally for coffee or to chat about the latest news from around town. Still, Linda remained vigilant. Karen's absence from the neighborhood gatherings hadn't gone unnoticed, and Linda suspected it wasn't just because of the balloon prank. Karen had always been at the center of the HOA's activities, directing things with her self-imposed sense of authority, and now she was strangely silent, like a storm cloud waiting to gather strength before unleashing its full force. Linda wasn't sure when it would come, but she knew that Karen wasn't the type to let a humiliation slide. It wasn't just about losing the power she had over the neighborhood. Karen had been embarrassed, and people like her didn't forget that kind of thing. One afternoon, as Linda was tending to her garden, she saw Karen walking briskly down the street, her eyes locked straight ahead, completely ignoring everyone around her. It was the first time she had seen Karen out and about in weeks. The thought crossed Linda's mind that maybe Karen had been waiting for the right moment to strike back, to remind everyone who was in charge. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but Linda couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. It was as if Karen were silently plotting her revenge. That evening, as Linda sat on her porch, she noticed that Karen's car was parked in its usual spot, but this time, there was something different about it. The car was clean, no longer covered in balloons. But the noticeable absence of the cheerful decorations made Linda uneasy. It wasn't that the balloons had been an eyesore, it was that Karen had taken them off, likely in an attempt to reassert control, to make things look as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Linda could feel it, the air was thick with tension, and she wasn't sure if the neighborhood had truly turned the page or if Karen was simply biding her time. The next day, Linda went about her usual routine, picking up the kids from school, preparing dinner, and catching up with the neighbors as they passed by. The sense of unease, however, lingered in the back of her mind. As the evening drew closer, Linda noticed more cars gathering near Karen's house, parked along the street in a way that was far too organized to be coincidence. It seemed like a small gathering, but the way people were standing around Karen's yard, talking in hushed tones, felt far too deliberate. The prickling sensation on Linda's skin grew stronger, and she decided to walk over to see what was going on. As she approached, she realized that the gathering was not one of camaraderie or friendly conversation. It was a tense, whispered conversation about the recent events, about the prank that had changed the neighborhood's tone. Linda recognized a few familiar faces, some of the neighbors who had once been a part of Karen's informal posse, but they didn't seem as confident now. Their faces were tight, their eyes darting around as if they were worried about someone overhearing. Linda stood at the edge of the group, listening carefully. "I can't believe she got away with it," one of the neighbors muttered, clearly speaking about Linda. "She's just getting away with doing whatever she wants, and now it's like the whole neighborhood is turning against Karen." Another neighbor added, "It's not like Karen doesn't have a right to stand up for the rules. If people keep breaking them, this neighborhood's going to turn into a circus. No one's going to care about keeping up appearances anymore." The conversation continued, but Linda had heard enough. It was clear that Karen's influence was still trying to claw its way back. People were speaking in hushed tones about what needed to be done to regain control, to restore the order Karen believed in. Linda's heart pounded in her chest, but instead of retreating, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the group. "You know, I've been listening to all of you," she said, and the group turned in surprise. "I think it's time for you to realize that some things just aren't that important. It's a few balloons, for heaven's sake. I'm not out here trying to tear down everything you've built. I just want my kids to have a good time. Isn't that what this neighborhood is supposed to be about, being able to live our lives without being constantly policed?" Karen, who had been standing silently at the edge of the group, finally spoke up, her voice sharp. "You're disrupting the order, Linda. And if you don't understand that, then maybe you'll have to learn the hard way." Linda stood her ground, facing Karen directly. "You can keep trying to control everything, Karen, but there's one thing you can't control, and that's the people who've decided they're done with your reign. I don't care about your standards. I care about my kids. I care about what makes this neighborhood feel like a community, not a place where you're told how to live." The group stood in stunned silence, the tension thick enough to cut through with a knife. Linda felt her heart racing, but there was no turning back now. It wasn't just about the balloons anymore, it was about something deeper, about the way Karen had tried to hold everyone in her grip, making them afraid to live their lives freely. Linda had already taken her stand, and there was no going back. After a long moment, the group began to disperse, some of them murmuring amongst themselves, others exchanging uncertain glances. Karen, though, was silent as she walked back to her house, her face flushed with anger and frustration. Linda watched her go, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. She had taken the risk of confronting Karen, but she knew it had been necessary. Whether or not the neighborhood would ever truly change, Linda had at least planted the seed of a different way of living, one where everyone didn't have to conform to someone else's version of right. The power of that moment was something Linda would carry with her for a long time, and she knew it had been worth every moment of uncertainty and tension. It wasn't just about balloons. It was about finding the strength to stand up to the things that tried to take away your right to live freely. And that, Linda knew, was the greatest victory of all. The days following Linda's confrontation with Karen were filled with a peculiar mix of anticipation and relief. Despite the tension that still hung in the air, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the neighborhood. It wasn't just the balloons that had sparked this change, it was the underlying shift in the dynamic of the entire community. What had once been a place where people followed rules without question, where conformity reigned supreme, was beginning to show signs of life, a pulse of rebellion, a quiet defiance against the overbearing control that people like Karen had tried to impose. Linda had never set out to be a catalyst for change, but in standing up for her own family, for her daughter's birthday, she had unwittingly set a series of events in motion that were too big to ignore. For the first time, Linda found herself truly questioning what it meant to belong to a community. The old rules, the ones that Karen had insisted upon, those rules that governed every small detail of their lives, from the color of the paint on their houses to the number of balloons that could be tied to a birthday banner, now seemed far less important. What truly mattered was the sense of togetherness, the willingness to support each other, and the ability to share in life's simplest joys without being judged or restricted. In the days after the prank, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. More neighbors stopped by Linda's house for casual conversations, some even staying for coffee or a brief chat about their own lives. It wasn't just a hi on the sidewalk anymore, it was an invitation to connect, to share stories, and to offer support in ways that hadn't been possible before. The divide that had once existed, between those who followed Karen's rules and those who simply wanted to enjoy their lives, was now blurring. But it was still hard to ignore the fact that Karen hadn't backed down. She may have been embarrassed by the balloon prank, and her car may have been the brunt of jokes for a while, but Linda knew Karen was not someone who would just let things go. That sense of tension, the feeling that something was still simmering just beneath the surface, never quite left Linda's mind. She had thought the whole matter would settle down in time, but she couldn't shake the fear that Karen's pride had been wounded far more deeply than anyone realized. Linda had seen Karen's response at the last confrontation, the cold, stiff way she turned and walked away. It was as if she was biding her time, gathering her strength for the next strike. One afternoon, as Linda was walking to the mailbox, she saw Karen standing outside her house, staring at Linda's home from across the street. It wasn't unusual for Karen to stand at her front door, watching the street as she often did. It was part of her way of keeping tabs on the neighborhood, but today, there was something different about the way she stood there, something that made Linda's stomach turn. There was no mistaking the look in Karen's eyes as their gazes met. The quiet, simmering anger was unmistakable. Linda didn't have to be a mind reader to know what Karen was thinking. She knew that Karen was still angry, still plotting how to regain control over a neighborhood that, in her eyes, had slipped from her grasp. For a brief moment, Linda considered crossing the street and confronting Karen once again, but she quickly dismissed the idea. There was no point in trying to fight someone who wasn't willing to see reason. Karen had made it clear that she believed she was the rightful authority in the neighborhood, and she wouldn't be satisfied until she had restored her sense of power. But Linda also knew that she couldn't live in fear, not anymore. She had fought for her right to let her daughter have a fun, memorable birthday, and she wouldn't let anyone, not even Karen, take that away from her. She didn't want conflict, but she wasn't going to let herself be intimidated either. That evening, Linda was sitting on her porch, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The warm summer breeze was just starting to cool, and she could hear the faint laughter of children playing in the distance. For a moment, it almost felt like life had returned to normal, like the old tensions had melted away. But as Linda looked down the street toward Karen's house, she saw that the door was open again, and Karen was standing there, staring at her, watching her every move. The intensity of the stare sent a chill through Linda, but she stood firm, her posture straightening as she felt the familiar surge of defiance rise within her. The next day, as Linda was getting ready for work, she heard a knock on the door. She opened it to find a member of the HOA standing on her front porch. The man, a relatively new member of the board, was holding an envelope. "Good morning, Linda," he said, his tone polite but somewhat formal. "I'm here to deliver this notice regarding your recent interactions with Karen and the HOA's rules about decorations. There's been a complaint about the balloon prank, and we need to discuss it." Linda felt her pulse quicken as she took the envelope. She had suspected that something like this might happen, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon. The HOA was notorious for siding with Karen, and Linda knew that she had to be prepared for whatever came next. She opened the letter, reading through it carefully. It was a formal notice from the HOA, citing a violation of neighborhood decorum due to the balloon prank. The letter outlined that Linda was in violation of the neighborhood standards regarding public displays of excessiveness and that a fine would be imposed unless she agreed to remove the disruptive influence from her property. Linda clenched the letter tightly in her hand, frustration building. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm despite the anger simmering inside her. The HOA representative left, and Linda stood there for a moment, staring at the letter. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't let this go on. Karen had already made it clear that she was willing to go to great lengths to get what she wanted. The HOA, acting on Karen's influence, was now trying to turn a harmless prank into a formal violation, and Linda wasn't about to let them get away with it. Linda immediately called Emma, her lawyer, explaining the situation. "It's just a joke, Emma. It's not like I violated any serious rules. The balloons were harmless, and now the HOA is trying to make me pay for it. I won't let Karen win this time." Emma listened carefully, and after a long pause, she spoke. "You're right, Linda. This is absurd. The HOA can't just impose fines for something as harmless as a prank. I'll help you fight this, but we need to gather some evidence and prepare a formal response. We're not letting them get away with this." With Emma's help, Linda began preparing for the upcoming meeting. She gathered statements from her neighbors, some of whom had expressed support for the harmless prank. She also compiled a list of other incidents in the neighborhood where people had made similar, non-disruptive displays of creativity, decorating for holidays, putting up temporary displays for special occasions, and how the HOA had never once interfered. The more Linda thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about the balloons, it was about power. It was about Karen trying to reclaim control over a neighborhood that had started to reject her authority. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and Linda walked into the room with a newfound sense of resolve. She knew that Karen would be there, probably sitting at the head of the table with her usual self-righteousness. But Linda was no longer afraid of her. She wasn't afraid of the HOA either. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply fought for her daughter's right to have a fun birthday, and if that made her a target for Karen's ridiculous crusade, then so be it. As the meeting began, Karen immediately stood up, her voice filled with indignation as she began to speak. "This is about the disruption Linda caused in our community with that balloon prank. It was a blatant disregard for the rules. The entire neighborhood was affected by it, and it's time the board took action to ensure this doesn't happen again." Linda waited for her turn, her hand steady as she prepared her response. When she spoke, it was clear, concise, and filled with conviction. "I did nothing wrong. The prank was harmless, and it was never intended to cause harm to anyone. It was meant to bring some joy, some laughter, and that's exactly what it did. The issue isn't the balloons, the issue is the control you're trying to exert over people's lives, trying to dictate every small detail. I won't be silenced." The room fell into a tense silence as the board members deliberated. Linda could feel the weight of their decision hanging in the air, but she stood her ground, knowing she had done everything she could. After a few moments, the board president finally spoke. "We've reviewed the situation, and after careful consideration, the board has decided to overturn the fine. The balloons, while excessive, were not harmful, and this will not be classified as a violation of the community standards. We encourage everyone to consider the impact of their actions, but we do not find that Linda's actions warrant any penalties." Linda felt the weight lift off her shoulders as she exhaled in relief. She had won. Not just for herself, but for the entire neighborhood. The message was clear: the HOA, and by extension Karen, could no longer dictate how people lived their lives. The neighborhood had changed, and Linda had helped lead that change. As the meeting adjourned and Linda left the room, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The balloons had been more than just a joke, they had been a symbol of resistance, of reclaiming personal space and freedom. And in the end, it wasn't just about the prank, it was about standing up for the right to live authentically, without fear of judgment or control. She had won, not just a battle, but a new sense of freedom, and she knew that the neighborhood would never be quite the same again.